The widow walked into the Duke's midwinter ball wearing a gown 3 seasons out of fashion and carrying a locked diary against her ribs. And the moment her foot touched the marble, 400 people stopped breathing at once. She had come to return a key and a secret, and she would leave having taken back a name. Her name was Seraphina Vale, and 1 year ago she had been somebody. 1 year ago she had a husband, a house with her initials carved above the door, and a future that didn't require her to count candles. Now she had a borrowed carriage she could not afford to keep past midnight, a cottage with a leaking roof at the edge of the Aldermere lands, and the clothes she stood in. The sapphire silk had been her mother's, taken in twice at the waist and let down once at the hem, and she had spent the whole carriage ride pressing the creases out of it with her gloved palms, because a woman who arrives looking desperate is heard as a beggar, and she had not crossed 30 miles of frozen road to be a beggar. She was 24 years old, and she had buried a husband, lost a title, and watched her father's name struck from the parish roll in the space of a single winter. At the top of the staircase she stopped. Below her the ballroom of Aldermere House opened like a struck match. 1,000 candles, gold leaf, climbing every column, crimson drapery, and a sea of the most powerful people in the country, turning one by one to look at the girl no one had invited. A footman near the door said her name aloud, uncertain, and the uncertainty traveled through the crowd like a crack across ice. She held the diary tighter. It was a small thing, gilt-edged, bound in dark green leather gone soft at the corners, with a brass clasp and a lock no one but she could open. Edmund had given it to her on their wedding morning. "Write it all down," he had said, smiling, that tired smile he wore by then, every cruelty, every kindness, so that when they tell the story wrong, and they will, Sarah, there is one true copy left in the world. She had thought it a strange gift for a bride. She understood it now. At the far end of the room, beneath the largest chandelier, the Duke set down his glass. Theron Aldermere was 33 years old and built like something carved for a cathedral niche. 6'3", broad through the shoulder, with thick, dark chestnut hair, swept back from a face so unfairly handsome that women had been known to forget their own husbands' names in his presence. His eyes were a pale, glacial blue, and they went through a person rather than landing on them. He wore bottle green velvet and a single emerald at his throat. And he had been, until 30 seconds ago, in the middle of a sentence to the woman the whole court expected him to marry. He did not finish the sentence. He was looking at the widow on the stairs the way a man looks at a debt he thought he had buried. A perceptive footman, a thin boy of perhaps 16, holding a tray he had forgotten he was holding, watched the Duke's hand close slowly around the stem of his glass until the knuckles went white, and the boy thought, with the strange instinct of servants who learn to read a room before they are old enough to shave, that whatever was about to happen here had been waiting a very long time to happen. Beside the Duke stood Lady Calantha Frost, the daughter of a marquis, 22, elaborate auburn curls, and a gown of emerald and diamonds, who had spent 11 months arranging to become the Duchess of Aldermere. She followed the Duke's stare to the top of the stairs, and her painted fan paused. "Who?" Lady Calantha said in a voice pitched to Carrie. "Let the help in through the front?" A ripple of laughter moved through the nearest guests. It was not loud. It did not need to be. It was the particular laughter of people who have decided all at once that a thing is beneath them, and it reached Seraphina as clearly as if it had been shouted. She did not flush. She had spent a year being laughed at by smaller people than these, and the laughter only owns you if you let it land. She came down the staircase one step at a time, her spine straight, the diary held against her heart, and she did not look at Lady Calantha at all. She looked at the Duke, and the Duke, God help him, looked back. Now, if you have ever watched the world decide that someone was nothing and quietly, fiercely, wished to see them proven the realest person in the room, then you already belong here. This is the Duchess Diaries, and this is the only kind of love story I tell. The overlooked woman, the one the ballroom dismissed, turning out to be the one who outranked them all. Take a breath and subscribe, because what this widow is carrying up that staircase is about to bring a duke to his knees, and you are going to want to be here when it does. She remembered the last time she had stood in a great room full of powerful people and waited for them to decide what she was. It had been a courtroom 11 months ago, and it hadn't had candles. It had high, cold windows and a clerk with an inkwell and a row of men in dark robes, and at the front of it on a chair had sat her husband. Edmund had been thin by then, white. The fever had not started, but the worry had done much of the fever's work already, and he had sat very straight the way she sat now, and when the question came, he had not defended himself the way they expected. They had expected him to plead, to weep, to bluster, to name accomplices, to beg for the mercy of the court. Instead, he had folded his thin hands in his lap and answered every question in a quiet, even voice, and given them nothing. Not because he had nothing to give, because the only true defense he could have made would have put a seal and a name in front of that courtroom that he had sworn to keep out of it. Her seal, her name, her grandfather's promise. And Edmund Vale had decided, somewhere in the long nights before the trial, that he would rather be remembered as a forger than let them turn his wife into a spectacle and then dispute her into the ground anyway. Arguing is what they want, her grandfather had said. Edmund had understood it the way only a man who loved a difficult truth could understand it. He had taken the whole weight of the lie onto his own narrow shoulders and carried it out of that courtroom, and 3 streets away, 11 days later, he had set it down for the last time. She had been at his bedside. She had held the hand that the court said had forged a crown seal, a hand that had, in fact, never forged anything in its life, that had built model ships for nephews and pressed flowers for her in the early days, and signed at the very end a single true document that no one but the two of them and a frightened country solicitor had ever seen. "Keep it locked, Sarah," he had whispered, meaning the diary, meaning all of it. "Not forever, until the keeping is louder. You will know the room when you walk into it." She hadn't known what he meant. She had thought it the wandering of a fevered man. She knew the room now. She had walked into it not 20 minutes ago, down a staircase, in her mother's made-over gown. The year between had been a long lesson in smallness, and in how quickly a name could be unmade. A man could spend 40 years building a family standing, sitting on the right benches, marrying the right cousins, keeping the right silences, and a single afternoon in a paneled room could erase all of it, and then the people who had dined at his table would cross the street to avoid the daughter who carried it. She had counted those crossings that first winter. She had stopped counting at 20. The men had come for the house within a week of the burial. Aldermere's men, polite and thorough, with a list and a cart. They had let her keep what was strictly hers, and disputed the rest. And the rest was nearly everything, because a wife's things have a way of being argued into a husband's estate when the estate is being seized. She had saved 3 things from the cart: her mother's gown, the seal she had worn under her collar since the funeral, and the diary from the false bottom of a writing box Edmund had built for exactly that purpose. With those and a few changes of linen, she had gone to the only roof left in her name, the dower cottage at the cold edge of the Aldermere lands, a 2-room stone thing with a sagging roof and a chimney that drew badly, the kind of property a great estate keeps on its books and forgets to maintain. She had lived there through the winter. She had learned which corner of the roof leaked, and to bank a fire so it lasted the night, and to read by 1 candle to save the others. She had learned that the people of the nearest village were not unkind, only frightened, that the wife of a man the Duke had destroyed was a dangerous person to befriend, and she had learned to want nothing from them, which is a harder thing than it sounds. And through all of it, every night, by the 1 candle, she had done the thing her husband and her grandfather had both told her to do. She had written it down, every cruelty, every kindness. The diary had grown heavy with the year. And somewhere in the heaviest weeks, when the roof leaked and the candles ran low, and the temptation to simply burn the diary and the seal and disappear into a quiet, anonymous life had been very strong, she had understood at last what the keeping was for. It was not for revenge. Her grandfather had been too wise for revenge, and Edmund too gentle. It was for the record. It was so that the truth would exist somewhere, intact and dated and sealed on the day, and there is always such a day if one lives long enough, that the people who had unmade her name grew careless or greedy or simply arrogant enough to throw a great public ball and post the engagement that depended on her staying buried. The Duke of Aldermere had announced his betrothal to the daughter of a marquis. The settlement, every gossip in 3 counties knew, was built on the marchlands, the lands the Duke could only bring to a marriage if the Witham line stayed extinct. He had, in short, finally done the one thing that made the keeping louder than the shouting. He had made her erasure the foundation of something new and visible and proud, and a foundation can be examined. So she had hired the carriage she could not afford, and pressed her mother's gown, and come. She crossed the floor. The crowd parted for her not out of respect, but out of a kind of horror, the way water parts around something that should not be in it. And the orchestra, sensing the temperature of the room, let the music thin to a single uncertain violin, and then to nothing at all. She stopped 6 feet from the Duke of Aldermere. For a moment neither of them spoke. Up close he was worse than she remembered. The cold beauty of him, the way the candlelight loved the planes of his face, the faint stubble along a jaw that looked carved rather than grown. She had met him exactly twice before, both times at the edge of larger events, both times as the wife of a man this Duke had ruined. He had not bothered to remember her then. He remembered her now. "You," he said. "Your Grace," she answered and curtsied, a perfect, unhurried curtsy, the kind drilled into her in a schoolroom he did not know she had ever sat in. "You were not invited." "No," she agreed. "I was not." The honesty of it seemed to unbalance him. He had expected, perhaps, that she would lie or plead or weep, and she had done none of these. She simply stood there in her mother's made-over gown with a diary pressed to her chest, and met his glacial eyes with a pair of dark violet ones that did not look away. Then you will explain, he said, his voice dropping, going dangerous and quiet, why you are in my house. I came to return something to you, Seraphina said, and to collect something that is mine. Lady Calantha laughed again, brighter this time, performing for the ring of guests now drawn close around them. Collect, she echoed. Theron, the creature thinks she has left something here. Shall we ring for the steward? Perhaps she misplaced a mop. The Duke did not laugh. He was looking at Seraphina's gloved hands, at the diary, at the small black mourning ribbon tied around her right wrist over the satin, and something in his expression had begun, very slightly, to change. That ribbon, he said. My husband's, said Seraphina. I wear it for him. You remember Edmund, your grace. You took his lands. You took his bank. You called in 3 debts in a single afternoon, and you stood in the gallery of the House of Lords, and you called him a fraud, while he was 3 streets away dying of a fever your kindness might have spared. You remember Edmund. The ballroom had gone perfectly silent. The Duke's jaw tightened. Your husband, he said, each word laid down like a stone, stole from the crown. He forged a seal. He claimed a peerage and an inheritance that were not his. And when the fraud was discovered, he had the cowardice to die before he could be tried. I did not ruin an innocent man, madam. I exposed a thief. The lands reverted because they were never lawfully his. If you have come here to make me feel shame over it, you have wasted a borrowed gown. It was a cruel speech, and it was meant to break her, and the watching crowd leaned in to see it land. It did not land. He forged a seal, Seraphina repeated softly. Yes, that is the story. The famous forged seal of Edmund Vale, who dared to claim the lost marchlands and the title that went with them. The fraud of the century. The court was very satisfied with that story, your grace. It let everyone keep what they had taken. She tilted her head. Do you know, in all the trying and the condemning and the striking of names, that not one person ever asked the obvious question, which is, if the seal was forged, she said, then where is the real one? Far across the room by the door, the thin young footman set down his tray very carefully on a console table, because his hands had begun, for no reason he could name, to shake. The Duke went still. It was a particular kind of stillness, the stillness of a man who has built a great house on a foundation he has never personally inspected and has just heard, from somewhere beneath the floor, a sound that should not be there. The forged seal was destroyed, he said. Melted. I watched it done. You watched a seal melted, Seraphina agreed. You did not watch the real one because the real one was never in that courtroom. The real one was never lost at all. My husband did not forge a claim to the marchlands, your grace. She drew a slow breath, and for the first time her voice shook, not with fear, but with the weight of a year of being called a liar's wife. He married the claim. He married it the morning he gave me this diary. The marchlands were never Edmund's to forge a right to. They were mine to inherit. I am the last living grandchild of the 9th Marquess of Witham, and the seal of Witham, the true one, the crown-granted one, the one your forged seal story required everyone to forget, has been around my wrist since the day my grandfather died. She lifted her right hand, and there beneath the black mourning ribbon, threaded on a thin gold chain and pressed flat against the inside of her wrist, where she had carried it for a year, through every humiliation and every cold night in a leaking cottage, hung a heavy gold signet seal, ancient and worn and engraved, with a crowned crest that perhaps 4 people in that entire ballroom were old enough to recognize. One of them was the Duke of Aldermere. His hand shot out before he had decided to move it. He seized her wrist, not gently, and turned her gloved forearm toward the light, and the crowd gasped as one creature, because no man laid hands on a lady that way, and Lady Calantha made a small, sharp sound that was not quite a word. The Duke stared at the seal. He had spent 4 years of his life and a great deal of his fortune proving to the satisfaction of the courts that this object did not exist. He had built his standing in the Lords on the destruction of the man who had supposedly forged it. He had taken the Marchlands into his own holdings as the nearest qualifying peer once the line was declared extinct, and that acquisition was the single largest reason a Marquess was willing to give him a daughter. Every certainty he owned was engraved on the gold against her skin. "This is a forgery," he said. But his voice had lost its iron. "You destroyed the forgery yourself," Seraphina said quietly. "You told the room so not a minute ago. You cannot melt a thing and then find it again on a widow's wrist, your grace. One of those 2 seals is false. I have spent a year letting you believe it was mine. Look at it. Look at it properly. You know engraving. You know the hand of the crown's own goldsmith. Tell these people it is false and mean it, and I will walk out of this house and never trouble you again." The Duke did not tell the room it was false. He could not, because it was not. And he was, for all his cruelty, for all the ruin he had caused, not finally a stupid man. He had handled the supposed forgery 100 times during the trial. He had compared it, in the privacy of his study, late, with the door locked, and a single lamp burning, to the seal impressions in the Wytham archive he had purchased along with the lands. He had told himself the differences were proof of the fraud. He had never once let himself consider that the differences were proof the courtroom seal was the fake one, manufactured perhaps by the very people who stood to gain the Marchlands when the true heir was disgraced. He stood now with her gloved wrist in his hand, and the gold biting cold against his palm, and against his will the memory rose. A night 4 months into the proceedings, the archive spread across his desk, 2 impressions side by side in the lamplight. The courtroom seal had been crisper, newer. Its lines had bitten the wax cleanly, the way a freshly cut die bites. The Wytham archive impressions, the old ones, the indisputable ones, taken across 40 years of a real family doing real business, had been softer, worn, the crown's points just slightly rounded by use, exactly as a seal carried and pressed 1,000 times across a lifetime would wear. He had looked at the 2 of them for a long time that night. A less ambitious man, a man who hadn't already staked his name in the Lords, might have set down his glass and said aloud the thing the evidence was plainly saying. The crisp one is the copy, and the worn one is the truth, older than the crime it is accused of. He had not said it. He had poured another glass and told himself that a clever forger would naturally cut a clean new die, and that a peerage and a marriage and the largest acquisition of his career did not turn on the roundness of a crown's points by lamplight. He had told himself a story, the way the whole court had told itself a story, because the story let everyone keep what they had taken. He was thinking about it now. The gold seal in his hand was worn precisely the way the archive impressions were worn, soft at the crown's points, smoothed by a real lifetime of real use, and it had been pressed into a page in this woman's keeping, years before the crisp, clean lie had ever touched a courtroom. He had melted the copy and called it the original, and built a barony's worth of certainty on the ash. And the original had been 30 miles away the whole time, warm against the inside of a widow's wrist, in a leaking cottage on his own land, while he dined off her grandfather's silver and arranged to marry the alliance her erasure had made possible. "Where did you get this?" he said. It was barely a whisper. "From my grandfather when I was 9, said Seraphina. "He put it in my hand and he said, 'They will come for this one day, Sarah, and they will tell you it is a lie, because the truth would cost them too much. Do not argue with them. Arguing is what they want. It makes it a quarrel between equals, and they will outspend you. Simply keep it, and write it all down. And one day, the keeping will be louder than all their shouting.'" Her dark violet eyes were bright now. "My husband knew. He married me, knowing what I was and what it would cost him, and he tried to claim it lawfully on my behalf because a woman could not. And your court called him a thief for it and broke him for it. And I have spent a year wearing his death on my wrist beside the seal he died trying to protect." There was not a sound in the ballroom. Even Lady Calantha's fan had stopped. "That is a great deal of story," the Duke said at last, slowly, "and not one page of proof." "No," Seraphina agreed, "not one page." And she lifted the diary. She had carried it up the stairs and across the floor and through the whole of his cruelty, and now she knelt, there, in the center of the ballroom, in her made-over gown. And she set the small gilt-edged book on the low marble table beside her, and she rested her fingertips on the brass clasp. "My grandfather had this lock made," she said, "with a key he gave to no one. There is no key. There never was. It opens to a word and a turn, and the word is one only the blood of Wytham would ever think to try, because it is the name of a child who died before the parish ever recorded her, the name only the family kept." She looked up at the Duke. "You bought the Wytham archive. You have read every paper my family ever filed. You will not find the word in any of them. But if I open this diary in front of all these people, with my own hand, on a lock that has defeated 3 locksmiths and a magistrate's clerk, you will have to ask yourself, Your Grace, how a forger's widow comes to hold the one word the true heir would know." And she turned the clasp. It opened with a small, clean, final click that in the absolute silence of that vast golden room sounded like a door being unlocked in a much larger house. Inside on the first page, in a child's careful hand, grown into a woman's, was a line of writing the Duke of Aldermere would remember for the rest of his life. "I am Seraphina of Wytham, and if you are reading this without my leave, then I am dead, and you are a thief, and the seal you could not find is the seal I have kept." Beneath the writing, pressed into a circle of dark red wax on the page itself, old wax set years ago, cracked at the edges with age, was the impression of the very seal that hung from her wrist, the crowned crest, the true one, made by the date inked beneath it, 4 years before the supposed forgery the Duke had melted ever came into being. He looked at the wax. He looked at the seal. He looked at the date. And the Duke of Aldermere, who had not bowed his head to any living soul in 11 years, felt the whole architecture of his certainty go silent beneath him at once, like a held note finally released. "Get up," he said. His voice was not cold now. It was something else entirely. Seraphina did not get up. "I have knelt in this house before, your grace," she said. "I knelt when your men came to inventory my husband's things while he was still warm. I knelt to pick my mother's gown out of the crate they were going to sell. I have done enough kneeling in Aldermere for one lifetime. If you want me up, you will have to give me a reason." For a long moment the Duke of Aldermere stood over the kneeling widow and the open diary and the impossible seal, with 400 of the most powerful people in the country watching, and the future he had arranged, the marriage, the Marchlands, the certainty, balanced on his next word. Lady Calantha understood it before he spoke. "Theron," she said, and there was an edge of panic under the silk now. "She is a fraud, a clever one. The seal is a copy, the diary is a trick. Anyone can press old wax, have her removed, have her arrested. You cannot seriously... Anyone can press old wax," Seraphina agreed without turning around, still on her knees, her voice carrying with terrible calm. "But not anyone can press it years before the seal it matches was supposedly forged. Look at the date, my lady. Read it aloud to the room if you can bear to. Or shall I?" Lady Calantha did not read it aloud. She looked instead to her father, and the Marquis of Holt stepped forward out of the crowd, a heavy gray-haired man in black and silver court dress, a man who had buried 2 scandals of his own and knew exactly how this kind of thing was managed. "A diary," he said with the weary contempt of a man addressing a problem rather than a person, "proves nothing but that the woman owns a pen and a candle." The line was declared extinct by the Court of Chancery. The reversion was confirmed under seal. There are signatures on those documents, Aldermere. Mine, yours, the Lord Chancellor's, and a great many settlements have been built on them since. You will not unmake a chancery decree in a ballroom on the strength of a widow's penmanship. If she has a claim, let her bring it to the courts in the proper form, at the proper expense, over the proper years. He let the last 3 words land because they were the real argument. The courts cost money and time, and she had neither, and everyone in the room knew it. It was, Seraphina thought, exactly what her grandfather had warned her of. They would not deny the truth. They would simply make the truth too expensive to prove and call that justice. Arguing is what they want. She felt the old, cold despair reach for her, the same despair that had sat with her in the cottage through the worst weeks. And she let it come, and looked at it and set it down. Because there was one thing the Marquis of Holt had not reckoned with, and it was the same thing the courtroom had not reckoned with 11 months ago, and it was kneeling on the marble with its hand on a brass clasp. "You are quite right, my lord," she said, rising at last, slowly, to her full height, the diary in her hands. "I cannot afford the courts. I never could. That is precisely why your courts found it so easy to call my husband a thief, because the cheapest verdict was the convenient one, and no one in that room had to pay for it but him." She turned, and now she did face the Marquis and the room and the 400 faces. "But you have made one error tonight that the courtroom did not. The courtroom was closed, its doors guarded, the only ears those of the men who profited from the verdict. This room is not closed. 400 of the best born in the country have now seen a seal worn soft by 40 years of use, and a wax impression dated 4 years before the supposed forgery, and you cannot guard 400 mouths. You may starve my claim in Chancery for a decade. You cannot make these people unsee what they have seen tonight." She paused. That is the thing about keeping a true copy, my lord. You only have to read it aloud once in the right room, and it stops being mine to suppress and starts being everyone's to remember. A low murmur moved through the crowd. Not laughter this time, but something closer to the sound a jury makes when it has quietly changed its mind. The Marquis of Holt heard it, and his heavy face tightened, because he had spent 40 years in rooms like this one, and he knew the precise moment a room turned, and he had just heard it turn. "Theron," Lady Calantha said again, and the panic was no longer under the silk. It was in her voice plainly now. "Say something. She is making fools of us. Have her removed. You cannot let her, Calantha." He did not raise his voice. He did not even turn his head. "Be quiet." The Marquis's daughter went white. The Duke crouched. He, the Duke of Aldermere, lowered himself onto one knee on the marble floor of his own ballroom so that his glacial pale blue eyes were level with the dark violet ones of the widow he had spent a speech humiliating, and he reached out, and he did not take the seal, and he did not take the diary. He took very carefully her gloved hand. "I melted a forgery," he said low, "for her and not for the room, though the room heard every word. I have asked myself more than once, in the small hours, why a man who would forge a peerage would make a copy so nearly perfect that I had to study it for a month to find the flaws. And why, if he were truly a fraud, he went so quietly to his grave and left a widow with nothing but a locked book. I told myself the answer was cowardice. I think I always knew it was something else." His thumb moved once across the back of her glove. "I think I knew, and I did not look, because looking would have cost me everything I had built on not looking. That is the truth, and you may do with it what you like, Your Grace of Wytham." It was the first time anyone had called her by her right title in a year. Something in Seraphina's chest, held tight and cold for 12 months, cracked clean down the middle. She did not weep. She had promised herself on the carriage ride that whatever happened, she would not weep in front of these people. But her breath caught, and the Duke saw it catch, and the cold, beautiful, exacting man the whole court feared looked in that moment like a man who would have given the Marchlands and the title and the Marquess's daughter in his own right hand to take back a single afternoon in the House of Lords. "You called my husband a thief," she said unsteadily, "in front of men who could have saved him." "I did." "You will not do it again." "No," said the Duke of Aldermere, "I will not. I will stand where I stood and called him a fraud, and I will say his name, and I will say what I did, and I will say what you have shown me tonight. And I will do it in front of these same faces, if I have to drag every one of them back into this room at dawn." He paused. "It will not give him back to you, I know that. Nothing I do gives him back to you." "No," she agreed softly, "it does not. But the Marchlands are yours. The title is yours. They were stolen, and I held the stolen goods, and a man who finds he is holding stolen goods has only one honest thing he may do with them." He drew a breath, and for the first time in 11 years, the Duke of Aldermere said a sentence he had never once practiced in a mirror. "I return them. Tonight. With witnesses. With my name on the document and my reputation behind it, whatever that reputation is worth to you now." Across the room, the Marquis, Lady Calantha's father, who had been watching the destruction of his daughter's marriage with the expression of a man watching his own house burn, stepped forward at last. "Aldermere," he said sharply, "you are not thinking. The line was declared extinct. The reversion was lawful. If you reopen this, you reopen everything, every settlement, every signature, my own daughter's. I am thinking, my lord. For the first time in 4 years, said the Duke, rising, and he drew Seraphina up with him by the hand he had not let go, so that the widow and the Duke stood together in the center of the silent ballroom. The line was not extinct. It was standing in a leaking cottage at the edge of my lands, while I dined off her grandfather's silver. The reversion was not lawful. It was theft dressed as law, and I wore the dress. As for your daughter's settlement, he glanced finally at Lady Calantha, and there was no cruelty in it, only a terrible clear finality. Your daughter was promised a duke in the Marchlands. The Marchlands were never mine to bring to a marriage. I will not begin a life by handing my wife another woman's stolen inheritance as a wedding gift. The word wife landed in the room like a dropped chandelier. Lady Calantha's painted fan slipped from her fingers and clattered on the marble. Wife, she said, you, after one diary, one trinket, one performance on the floor you would throw away the alliance of a marquis for her? I would throw away a great deal more than that, said the Duke quietly. To stop being the man who did what I did to her husband? Yes. He turned back to Seraphina. The whole ballroom had ceased even to pretend it was not listening. 400 faces in crimson and gold and candlelight, and at the door the thin young footman with the shaking hands, who would tell this story to his grandchildren and be believed by none of them. I have no right to ask you anything, the Duke said. I know that. You came here to take back a name, and you have taken it. It is yours now, in front of all of them, and no court in the country will dare unsay it after tonight. You owe me nothing. You owe me less than nothing. He looked down at the open diary, at the line in the child's careful hand, at the impossible date in the wax. But I have spent 4 years building a life on the destruction of yours, and I find I would rather spend the rest of it building it back, not as penance. Penance you could refuse and be right to, as... He stopped, the unfairly handsome face suddenly unsure, as a boy's, as the only thing I have ever wanted that I did not already own. Stay. Not because I ruined you, in spite of it. Stay. And let me spend the years I took from you, learning to be a man you would have chosen if I had never touched your husband at all. Seraphina of Witham looked at the Duke of Aldermere for a long, long moment. She thought of Edmund, who had married a claim and a curse, and a girl with a locked book, and who had loved her enough to die quietly, rather than let them make her the public face of a fraud. She thought of the leaking cottage and the cold nights, and the seal warm against the inside of her wrist, where she had kept her grandfather's promise for a year. She thought of how loud the keeping had finally become. My grandfather told me, she said slowly, that one day the keeping would be louder than all their shouting. She glanced around the silent ballroom, at Lady Calantha, at the Marquis, at the 400 faces that had laughed at the help in the borrowed gown. Not half an hour passed, all of them now hanging on her answer like supplicants. I did not understand him until tonight. I thought he meant the seal. I thought he meant the proof. She looked back at the Duke. I think he meant that the loudest thing in any room in the end is the truth standing where it has every right to stand and refusing to apologize for it. And does the truth, said the Duke of Aldermere very low, have an answer for me? The truth, said Seraphina, would like to read the rest of its own diary first. There are a great many cruelties and a great many kindnesses written in it, Your Grace, and I find I am not finished writing it. My grandfather told me to set down every cruelty and every kindness, so that when they told the story wrong, there would be one true copy left in the world. She closed the small gilt-edged book and lifted it once more to her chest, over her heart, over the seal, and for the first time since she had walked through his gilded doors, Seraphina of Witham smiled. You have been, until tonight, a very long chapter of cruelty. I should like to see whether you can manage to become a chapter of the other kind. Ask me again when there is more kindness in the book than cruelty. I suspect the writing will not take as long as you fear. The Duke of Aldermere, cold, exacting, feared by every soul in that room, looked at the widow with the locked diary and the crowned seal and the made-over gown, and he smiled back, helpless and stunned, and entirely undone, like a man who has been handed, against every law of God and the courts, a second copy of a life he thought was already written. Then I will spend every day filling the book, he said, until you can hardly find the cruelty for the kindness. Outside in the cold, midwinter dark, a long line of the finest carriages in the country waited in the gravel for masters who had quite forgotten them. By the door, the thin young footman picked up his abandoned tray and found that his hands had finally stopped shaking. And inside, beneath 1,000 candles, in a ballroom that had meant to laugh a widow out the door, the orchestra, uncertain, then surer, then sure, began very softly to play again. One by one, the 400 faces that had laughed turned away from Lady Calantha and her father, and toward the widow and the Duke, and inclined their heads, because a room always knows, in the end, where the truth is standing. She had come to return a key and a secret. She left holding a diary, a name, and the first true page of a story she would, this time, be allowed to write herself.